I'm very happy to talk to the Wildflower Society. It's not about wildflowers, it's about the use of plants in the Amazon and how the people survive by having just about everything they need.
So Gillian, you've gone on mute.
They're advancing at the moment. Right, now I think it's going to work. And I'm not on mute anymore, am I? Can you hear me?
You're fine, we can hear you nicely.
Okay. Ethnobotany is really what this is about, the study of people and plants. And I'm going to talk a great deal about the Yanomami tribe in the Northwest Amazon that feature in these photos. I spent a lot of time with these wonderful people. At the moment, they're severely threatened by an invasion of gold miners and tin miners, but the new president of Brazil is trying to evict those, so there's more hope for the Yanomami than there was a month or two ago. So the Yanomami depend on plants for everything, as do most of the tribal Indians. This is their body paint, for example. Boiling up the plant of this tree called Bixa, or we call it the lipstick tree, because actually the dye that this boy is putting on his face, which is their main body paint, is also an ingredient of some companies in lipstick and also as a spice in some food. Gloucester cheese has achiote in it, and so does red Leicester. So it comes to us, something that's grown by the Amazon Indians. But look at these patterns. And the patterns usually mean something. We did a study of some of the patterns. The man there with all the dots on him is famous for having shot a jaguar, and he's entitled to that sort of skin pattern. But the other interesting thing about achiote is that it is insect repellent. So I wonder whether this, they started using it to keep off the insects and then thought it was pretty to paint, or the other way around. But it is very much a dual purpose product. The Yanomami cut down small areas of forest and then they plant their crops. The interesting thing about the Yanomami is that they plant as their staple bananas. Now, bananas come from Southeast Asia, but why have they used a plant that doesn't really belong in the Amazon? I think that's because they were once nomadic and they started agriculture after the banana was in South America, because most of the other tribes, as we'll see later, use the cassava plant or yucca, the manihot, and not bananas as their staple. But one of the most interesting things about the Yanomami is that they eat a lot of mushrooms. In fact, we've classified over 36 species of edible mushrooms amongst the Yanomami. I enlisted a friend of mine who's a mycologist to help me identify all the mushrooms that they use. So here we have two of them on this tray. One is the large brown one they call sami sami amu, and that means in Yanomami a stingray, sami sami. And it looks rather like the stingrays that are in the water in the Amazon. And the other one, the white one there, the frivolous, they call waikasi amu. Now you notice both those names end in amu, and that is a suffix for the edible fungi. When we were collecting fungi, we showed them every fungus we could find in the forest. And we were amazed that they had a good classification of the ones with amo, but all the others, they gave the name Unshelida. And I wondered what that was until I learned a little bit more Yanomami. And then I realized that they were just saying no bloody good. So they only put names on the ones that they found useful to eat. And we don't just believe that they can eat them. We watch them preparing them. And this is a common sight. The women who do most of the agriculture come in from the fields with these mushrooms that grow on the rotting logs in their fields or in the forest. So they come back in the evening like this lady here with the mushrooms ready to put in the pot and eat. And we check that they eat them. We eat them ourselves too afterwards when we've seen them eat them. And so this one is just showing us that the Favolis brasiliensis is good to eat. It's interesting because I worked with the Yanomami on 2 expeditions, and I never knew that they ate fungi. But then on my 3rd expedition, this couple, the lady there and the man and their little baby, came out as my informants about the uses of plants. And she started picking some mushrooms. So I asked what you were going to do with them. And she said, to eat, of course. And then I said, well, do you eat a lot of these? And she said, yes. And she started telling me about them. It's only the women who have any knowledge about the mushrooms. So I learned very quickly that in this sort of work in ethnobotany, there's a lot of information that either the women or the men have, and you need to both work with both sexes if you want to get all the information. Many of the hallucinogen plants, only the men know about. The mushrooms, in the case of the Yanomami, is the women. And actually, the Yanomami are the only tribe that eat a lot of mushrooms. All the others eat one, or it's just famine food. But this is an interesting slide you're looking at now, because these are packets with air-dried mushrooms. More recently, scientists have taken the work that I did in the 1970s, worked with the Yanomami to teach them to air dry the mushrooms and market them. And so now this tribe of the Yanomami, the Sanoma, are making a good living in selling their mushrooms to various specialist restaurants in Manaus and in the health food market. So some of the work we did there is now being commercialized and is helping the livelihood of the Sanoma tribe of the Yanomami. You're probably familiar with this plant, but it's much smaller than the ones you eat, a wild pineapple. Well, the pineapples come from South America, mainly outside the Amazon in the drier regions of northeast Brazil, but they're used a great deal in the Amazon. And this man on the left-hand side is taking the leaf of the banana and he is scraping off the soft tissue and he is making a bowstring from it. And so that pineapple is what they make their bowstring. And they take a young peach palm on the right-hand side and they make their bow from it. So here, this man is just smoothing up his bow with a knife, and then he'll take the string made from the pineapple, and there they have their bow and arrow for hunting. Look at the size of the bow. It's much taller than he is. They use huge bows that are very strong, where the arrows can reach to the top of the rainforest to knock down monkeys and other game that they eat. Well, one of the interesting things is that they go into the forest and they look for a tree called Virola in the nutmeg family, the Myristicaceae, and they strip off the bark, and like many other nutmegs, it has a red sap. You can see it oozing out there, and they take some big chunks of the bark and put it on a fire, as you can see in the bottom left there, and the sap oozes out in large quantities, and the top, the man is scraping it off and collecting it in a saucepan, and then they will boil it down, and then they'll dip their arrows in that, either their arrows for their bow and arrows or their blowgun tips, and they have a poison arrow. Interestingly, after that, they'll let the saucepan on the fire until it boils dry and looks like this. And there you can see it looks powdery. And they'll take this and use it as a snuff. And this is their main narcotic, their hallucinogenic snuff. One of the interesting things with the different tribes I've worked with, each one of them has some sort of narcotic. I'm going to talk about several others, but in the case of the Yanomamo, it's interesting that this same plant, the Virola, is used both as an arrow poison and as a part of their religious life, really. But they take and mix with that powder the leaves of this plant in the acanth family, Justicia pectoralis. They take these leaves, dry them, and mix it with the snuff, and that gives the snuff a very pleasant perfume because it contains another chemical called coumarin. Now, coumarin has a very, very attractive scent. It's been used in perfumery. It used to be in cigarettes at one time, until they found that coumarins are slightly carcinogenic. So it's interesting that they are still using this compound in their daily life. But I think in very small quantities, and lifespan is not very long, so I don't think it is doing them any harm. Their other favorite narcotic is tobacco, and they take the leaves and roll it up with ash in it and make a quid that they put between their lips and their teeth. This young man, who was helping as a porter on one of my expeditions, had just passed the puberty ceremonies, and so he was very proud that he's now allowed to use the tobacco quid. They're very strict about that. Until they have passed that rite, they can't use it. But this is a common sight in adult Yanomami to be having a quid of tobacco in them. And the ash makes it alkaline, and that brings out the alkaloids, nicotine and other compounds from the tobacco leaves. Sorry, we skipped one or two there. The other plant that the Yanomami have is this tree that you can see on the left-hand side, and it's in the legume family, Anadenanthera peregrina. It has disc-like seeds in the pods of this member of the legume family, and some other tribes of Yanomami, some of the other clans of Yanomami, grind up the seeds of this, and they use it as their snuff, as a narcotic. And it contains a compound called bufotenin. Now, you probably know that bufo is the Latin name of a toad. And on the right-hand side of your pictures, you can see a poison arrow toad. And the toad is poisonous because it contains bufotenin, and some tribes in Colombia just rub the tips of their arrow on the skin of this frog, and then they have a very effective arrow poison. So what we see with these Indians, and you'll see from the others I'm going to talk about, what some of the essentials they get from the forest without depending on Western civilization at all. Food, shelter, medicines, narcotics, arrow poisons, fish poisons. All of the 15 tribes I've studied in detail have all those items, but not necessarily the same ones. They use different plants for their narcotics, different plants for their medicines or arrow poisons. And so that's what makes the study of ethnobotany of the Amazon Indians so interesting. So we'll look at one or two other tribes. Here we have the Mayan Gong, as they're called in Brazil. In Venezuela, they're called Makiritari or Yekuana. They're quite a live tribe too, but they belong to a completely different language group from the Yanomami. Where I've been, where they live close together, they don't understand each other's language at all. They're completely different languages. The Mayan Gong are an Arawak group of Indians, so they speak one of the Arawak languages. Houses are interesting. You saw on the list of the necessities was shelter. They build these wonderful malokas, they're called, and in the making of this particular house that I studied in detail while they were making it, there were 16 different plants used. A wood that makes the poles that go into the ground, because they told me these don't rot when you stick them in the ground. Lighter woods to support the thatch roof, and of course, palm thatch for the roof. And it's tied together with various vines from the forest. So altogether, that house that they're building there used 16 different species from the Amazon forest, which just shows how much they know. And when we analyze the poles that go into the ground that they told me don't rot, we looked at them and we found that those poles are from a wood that is absolutely full of silica, sand grains in it. And this means that it's not attractive to the rotting things that rot many woods when it's stuck in the ground. So they're applying quite interesting science as they do it. Vines have many, many uses. This Yanomami is making a basket from a vine in the arum lily family, the Aeraceae, like our lords and ladies, but many of them in that family are big vines that go up in the top of the trees and the roots hang down, and they make those into a basket fiber. Some of the things one has to learn working with the Indians is when you must accept what they give you. In the case of the Mayan Gong, the first thing they do when you arrive in their village is give you a drink in a gourd like this, and you're meant to take it and drink it all. However, in some other villages I've been in of other tribes, you're meant to take a sip and pass it on to the next person. You have to learn what the hosts are expecting you to do. This is their beer, which is made with fermented manioc, cassava. They start the fermentation by chewing a little patch of it and putting that in. And in the case of the Mayan gong, it has to be a young virgin lady who starts the fermentation of their kashiri, as the drink is called. The Mayan gong too are very famous for their dugout canoes. They actually have quite a market for them now, selling them to the Brazilians. That is made from one piece of wood, and the seats there are actually stretching it out. They hollow it out using charcoal to burn it, and also with their axes, so a combination of both. So here is a completed Mayan gong canoe, one trunk of wood. They fell a tree in the forest, make the canoe, and then they roll it out on rollers to the nearest river. Sometimes that can be 500 meters away, because that's where the good tree for making a dugout canoe was. So some tribes are very good boatsmen and make canoes. The Yanomami that we started with are not, and they don't make canoes, but the Mayan gong who live next door are known famously for their canoes. Here's another group that I've been with called the Macu. They live on the upper Rio Negro on the border between Brazil and Colombia. And I show you in most of these tribes that we're looking at their houses, because you can see they look a bit different from each other. And again, they've probably got different plants that are making it. And the Mayan gong that we saw was a community house where the whole village lives. The Macu make individual family houses. So this man is making his family house. And he was a very knowledgeable man who gave us a great deal more information about the forest. For instance, here's a tree trunk in the fig family, the Moraceae, and they nick the bark of it and then collect the sap out of this tree. And then they take this sap and they simply dip their arrow in it, blowgun darts in the case of the Macu, and that is their arrow poison. They don't have to process it in any way, heat it or anything. They just use the crude latex of this Moraceae. So you see a different family from the Yanomami and a different way of preparation, but each tribe, what is remarkable, has found the things that they need from the area of the forest in which they live. One of the things that almost all the tribes I've been with is a fish poison. So on the left-hand side, you see the flowers of the piqui plant or Carioca glabrum. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the Macu Indians who put the leaves of a different plant, a euphorbia, on a bridge across a stream, and they're beating it with sticks. And the juices drip down, and then the women downriver from the men who are beating these plant there, and the fish are stunned, and they come to the surface and they gather up the fish, and then they have a big party eating all the fish that they get. This is interesting because it is a fish poison, but it is a poison by reacting with the gill membranes of the fish. And if you were to leave the fish a bit and not take it out of the water to eat, the fish would recover. They are stunned by this. So in other words, it doesn't kill all the fish in the stream, just the ones that are nearby where they're doing the poisoning, and those that escape recover. But it's a very important way for the Indians for being able to get a lot of fish to eat. The Macu also have a different narcotic as well. It is one that is more familiar in Western society because it's from the cocoa plant, or cocaine. And this man is taking the dried leaves of the cocaine and putting it into a mortar and pestle to make a powder. And we can see here again, this is a different tribe, the Bora, but on the left-hand side, you can see the green leaves being pulverized in the mortar and pestle. And then they would take the ash of various plants, they're quite particular about what plants, and mix that with the coca. And then they will take this and put it, you can see there, they're drying the leaves of the coca, and then they will put it, this powder with the ash and the leaves, between their lower lip and their teeth. And then they'll just let that sort of dissolve away gradually during the day. And they say that this gives them the stimulus to go out and hunt or do their work. And they get a mild amount of the actual cocaine that's in the leaf, but they also get a lot of nutrients out of it. And it's actually more important as a source of micronutrients to the Indian than it is as the stimulus. Again, ash is with this one because it releases the alkaloids when it's in an alkaline position. Here's the most used poison for arrows of any of the tribes. These Jarawara Indians are preparing curare. Curare comes from the bark of a member of the moonseed family, mixed with a member of the strychnos genus, which contains strychnine. So here they're scraping this off in order to put the two together and make their very strong arrow poison. Curare was noted as an interesting chemical in the 1920s, and it gradually became used in modern medicine as a muscle relaxant before surgery. Now they make artificial compounds, but originally it was from the curare plants that the medicinal use of curare came. And here is one of the Bora Indians with his blowgun that has been, the darts have been poisoned with curare. And as you can see, curare became an important compound in Western medicine. You can see this is one of various recipes of curare that are derived from the knowledge of the Amazon Indians. I think one of the tragedies of this is that the Indians haven't benefited at all from this, the inventors who discovered it in the forest. And that's true a lot of the early discoveries that have utilized their information. However, today we have the Convention on Biodiversity, and one is obliged to share intellectual property if anything is discovered. And so this is something very important. At Kew, we discovered from a poisonous plant in Costa Rica that it was very useful as a nematicide for in agriculture, killing nematodes. And the profits mainly go back to Costa Rica, not to Kew. This sharing of benefits is very important. But in the case of curare, no one of the tribes that discovered it benefited anything. And there's so many things in medicine from the forest. This book by the man who probably is the father of modern ethnobotany in the Amazon, Richard Evans Schultes, lists 1,200 medicinal plants of the Northwest Amazon. And he worked with a chemist called Robert Raffouf to analyze the various chemicals and see the truth of the medicines. And they have a very good pharmacopoeia in many of the tribes in the Amazon. Another interesting study I did was of the ceramics of the Amazon. Many tribes make pottery vessels of one sort or another. But what's that got to do with plants, you will ask? Well, the interesting thing that they take the clay and they mix it with ash. They burn the caripé tree and they take the bark of the caripé, burn it into and pulverize it into an ash. So here you see some carapé ash, a tree in the genus Licania in the plant family Chrysobalanaceae, which incidentally is the one on which I did my doctoral thesis at Oxford 65 years ago. Now, they take the clay and mix the ash. So you can see here the ash, and then they'll knead this together just like flour, and then they will make it into a vessel. Then they'll take that vessel and light a fire around it. They don't have a kiln or anything for their pottery. They just put it in a fire like this to burn. And you can see emerging here a pottery vessel in amongst the flames there. And it has now been fired. There it is. And a beautiful bowl it is. Well, then they will take the resin of another tree, the Kubaro tree, which is another member of the bean family, and they'll take a chunk of the resin from it and put that around the edge of the pottery. And this is a glazing material. There's a beautiful glaze. There is the bowl that you were watching there being made. I have this bowl. It's one of my prized possessions from the Amazon rainforest. And you can see why it's interesting to a botanist, because it's got ash amongst the clay, and it's got a plant resin as a glaze. And because it's got the ash, it's a particularly strong one, and you can put their pottery vessels on the fire and cook things in it. So it's very interesting. And this technique of using the ash in the pottery exists from right throughout the Amazon. I've seen it near the mouth of the Amazon. I've seen it at the foothills of the Andes to the extreme west of the Amazon region. Here's another tribe called the Deni, live in these rather small little huts. And why I show them is another interesting use from the forest. This lady has gone out into the forest and collected the plant I wanted to study from here. And this member of the moonseed family is their contraceptive plant. They will take the vine, and here she's beating it until the juices come out, and then they'll put this beaten vine in water and make a sort of drink. They'll filter it through a cloth so it doesn't have all the residue from the plant, just water and the juices from the plant. And then they will drink a large quantity of it, or the women will, and then they will vomit that out. Then they'll take about a pint and hold that in. And they say that they won't have a baby for 3 years. So Curaria tecunarum in the moonseed family is a contraceptive plant. And this is not the only contraceptive used by various Amazon Indians. I've seen another tribe that uses a sedge for this. Another tribe I've studied is far to the south, just on the edge of the Amazon forest, in the forests of Argentina, called the Guarani. And this is the Guarani choir. They are wonderful. I didn't want to frighten Janet by putting the music on the tape. We might have had another problem with that. So they are actually singing there. It was most impressive. Their own music. They have very interesting songs. But we spent a lot of time with the Guarani because we were working with them how to maintain their sustainable life with the pressures of Argentinian civilization. And we were able to get the government to extend their reserve by a very large amount by doing our ethnobotanical study. And I trained 3 graduate students on this project in Argentina. Well, they use an awful lot of different palms. And this one, the Pindó palm or Aracastrum, is probably their most important plant. We often in ethnobotany quantify which are the plants most important to them. And the Pindó in our classification came out as most important. It is an edible fruit. They use the leaves for many things. Their medicinal uses are the roots. And this one in the arum lily family, a philodendron. You may be familiar with philodendron as houseplants, but this one was the second most important one in our quantification of uses, an edible fruit, roots used for baskets, and leaves used in medicine. So it came out very, very important to us. They call it Quembe. You see the slashes on the tree on the left-hand side, a Macarium, another member of the bean family. And we met this little boy in the forest. We were out in the forest doing our work, and he went to one of these trees and slashed it, and he was collecting the juice of it. And so we asked him about it. Well, what are you doing that for? He said, my mother sent me out to get this. And they said, well, how did you know which tree? And he said, oh, I know what tree does what things. And of course I know this tree. And he said his mother had sent him out because he had a baby sister and she had a sore mouth. In other words, his baby sister had thrush. And the sap from this tree was a medicine for that. But what gladdened my heart here, something that often I hadn't seen, is that the children were learning and had a lot of knowledge. So I thought there's a future in the botanical knowledge there, because I've been in so many groups where it's only the very elders that still have retained this important botanical knowledge for the sustainable use of the forest. And the Guarani too have commercialized a bit because they made a trail for tourists who drive nearby their property. And they've made a trail of about 1 kilometer long, and they've identified all the trees and plants on it. And you can see the notice on it, this one in the front, Uvera puri, is their name, but it is Picrasma in the Cimarubaceae family. And so their guides will take tourists in Spanish and tell them all about the interesting plants that they use. This one, Picrasma, is actually one of their medicinal plants. So it's you pay, I think, probably the equivalent of about £1 to do a tour with them around the forest. The Chacobó in Bolivia is a tribe that one of my postdoctoral students studied. And so I want to say a little bit about this, because this is where we really began to quantify our botanical information and do what's called quantitative botany. We studied a hectare of the forest, 2.5 acres, and it had 649 individual trees on it. And when we asked the Indians, when we went out with them, about each tree, what it was used for, 95% of the trees, they knew what they would use it for. 91 species, 75 of which they used. 82% of all the individual species of trees on that hectare were used. So this really showed something that a lot of the politicians didn't believe, that the forest was so useful for the future and should not be destroyed. It was useful information for conservation. And we've done this with several different tribes over the time. So let's just see what the Chacobó used, what sort of uses that they had. The same as we've seen in some of the other tribes: food, fruits, seeds, latex, construction material, technology for their ceramics, their pottery, glues to stick things together, to stick the flights on their arrows, for example, soap and dyes, and of course, many different medicines. Most tribes have over 100 medicinal plants. Then in the case of the Chacobó, they did have some commerce. They gathered rubber, Brazil nuts, and made handicrafts, which they sold to the Bolivian population. So they were a tribe that was having their traditional life, but also were entering into the Western commerce. Then, of course, there are lots of other minor uses that I can't make a long list of: toys, perfumes, plants for magic, because most of these tribes have a lot of magic as well. And one of the challenges is sorting out, when they tell you that this plant is useful to cure a disease, you have to find out how they use it. If they say we boil it up and make a tea, then you think, well, that's probably a real medicine. But if they say we take a leaf and we wave it over and make a chant, then you realize that this is really just a magic plant. And so all this is part of what one has to sort out. Well, here are the data of the use for 4 different tribes that I and 3 different postdocs that I had studied. And you can see the percentage of useful trees of all the species on the plots that were used by these 4 different tribes, the Chacobó being on there, and 3 other tribes for these different things. This is the Panari in Venezuela, who didn't use quite as many of the forest trees as the others, because they live on the edge of the savanna and they use a lot of grassland things in their lifestyle. So here are the total percentage of trees on a hectare plot of these 4 tribes. The Chacobó, 79%. And so they really use a great many of their plants. The Panari at the bottom, because they also live in the grassland savanna. A few more interesting, useful plants that they use. The cupuaçu belongs to the cocoa genus. I think I probably mentioned this one in my last lecture to you, but it is a very important crop in Brazil now to make desserts, smoothies and ice creams, but it's one that they have been using. We have taken various of their plants into Western civilization. Brazil still uses the indigenous name rather than a new Portuguese name. Cupu is the Guarani or Tupi name for the cocoa plant, and Asu means large. And so it just means a large cocoa. And you can see the Latin name says it's a large flowered cocoa in Latin there, grandiflora. And here are some of them now in a market in the town of Manaus in Brazil. So it's very common now in Brazil. It's delicious. In fact, the other day when I was up at Kew, I went to dinner with a Brazilian student who is there, and she served me cupuaçu dessert. She had brought back some pulp of cupuaçu on her last visit to Brazil. So that brought back some memories to me. This one, angiroba in Brazil, a member of the mahogany family. And these seeds fall off the tree in the rainy season and can be gathered. And they are used in various perfumes and in the cosmetics. It's rather important in cosmetics. And I worked with a company in Brazil that was very interested in doing fair trade. And they wanted to make sure that all the plants that they extracted from the Indians got a fair deal. And I was commissioned to go and study the villages where they were buying this plant. And also some villages that were just using the normal trading route with lots of intermediaries along the way. I was so impressed with the standard of living from those that got fair trade compared with the ones that just use the general market. And so that is another very important thing that I have learned in these studies. And if you're trying to commercialize things, fair trade in angiroba, fair trade in Brazil nuts too. And again, I've seen fair trade and unfair trade in the use of Brazil nuts quite a lot. Another plant that's come into commerce in Brazil in a big way is a guaraná. It's a member of the soapwort family, the Sapindaceae, Paulinia cupana. And the Indians for many, many years have taken those black seeds, fermented them and pulverized them, and they make a drink that they add to their water before they go off in the morning. It's a source of caffeine. But in Brazil, in any restaurant or any bar, you will see guaraná for sale. It's the Coca-Cola of the Amazon, a caffeine-containing soft drink. And so, again, something that from the Indians that has been put more into general use. In fact, you can buy guaraná in some places in London. And I finish with one or two sad photographs, because this is what I've also seen. And often now in places where I have been, that was territory of the Indians, particularly in the time of the last president of Brazil. He suspended many of the laws that protected Indian territory. And so this was the sort of thing that was happening, burning down that forest. Now, if you look at this piece of forest there, and you think of the statistics I've talked about, how many useful species there are, it's just going up into carbon into the air and causing climate change. And here we go back to the Yanomami that I started with. And there is a sad Yanomami looking at a cassiterite mine for tin, in the middle of his forest, and you can see all the forest around him has been cut down. But this is a photo that's interesting because it's a photo of an area taken a week or two ago when the new president has sent in the troops to evict the miners from Yanomami territory. And so there is some good news in there, but how many Yanomami and how much forest has been cut down during the term of President Bolsonaro? So they're only just beginning to recuperate from what has happened. Here's one of the gold miners' camps, and this is just when it's been set on fire by the police that come to evict the miners. So that is good news that President Lula of Brazil now is trying to do something about the miners that have invaded indigenous territory. Here, in fact, is the commander of this group that is commissioned to evacuate all miners from Yanomami territory. And so I am very glad to see that he is there. But look at the awful destruction around in the area that's already been done. Here is President Lula of Brazil, took office on the 1st of January this year with the promise that he would attend to the needs of the indigenous peoples and that he would stop deforestation. We know that when he was president in his first 2 terms of office, he did stop deforestation. So I have every confidence he will do so now. But here he is already. In February, he made a visit to the Yanomami. And so he went himself to give time to draw attention to the fact that something needed to be done about this. So there are good things as well as bad things in Brazil, but look at all the red areas here, the total areas of the Amazon that have been totally deforested by 2022. A lot more that you don't see there has been partially destroyed. And so there is quite a lot of further damage. And this is one of the things that is causing a drier climate in the Amazon and is contributing carbon dioxide to climate change. So we desperately need to stop the deforestation of the Amazon if we have any hope of stopping climate change. And finding ways of learning how these people, the Indians, have managed the forest is a key to sustainability for our whole world. So it's been a great privilege that I've had to spend so much time and so long amongst these Amazon Indians. So I thank you very much for listening to this, a long way from wildflowers that we're all interested in. But may I now wish you a good hunting season in the UK as we